All right, we'll come to the next presenter. That is Phil Greene from the BBC. He is a technology analyst and business analyst also, and lead technologist at the BBC. As a business analyst, he's probably has a very good standing in the corporation because they all like to shine when he comes along as a business analyst, that my business is working, my department is really working. So that makes him the next best friend probably of many departments. And Phil will talk about the perspective of the viewer, the loudness issues from the viewer's perspective. Are there any, in the BBC at least? And if there are, how many, and what other perspectives are there and problems? Phil, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Florian. I'm only going to have 8 slides today, so I'm going to try and get through this quite quickly. A little bit about me. I started off in the defence industry, working on sonars, so I did a lot of work on submarines. About 16 years ago, I joined the BBC, and I've been a project manager mainly in that period, usually working for the World Service. About 3 years ago, I joined the internal consultancy team, so rather than doing things now, I actually plan things. So the reason I'm here is that I was asked by Audio Music last year to investigate the potential of adopting R128 in the BBC. So how do I actually change slides? Is this the...
Yeah, that's
okay. So earlier this year, I met with Rupert Brunn and Simon Tuff from Audio Music to discuss what they were looking for. We discussed these sort of issues here. EBU R128, the USA have passed the CARM Act, Canada are also involved in this, and the UK have had some self-regulation. BCAP in 2007 put in well, they had some self-regulation to reduce the noise of commercials, and the complaints went down from about 100 to about 45 over the space of 2 years, so we knew that something was happening. This meeting, though, it did go on a bit, and I didn't really know what I was actually meant to do at the end of this meeting, so just as Simon was leaving and Rupert was leaving, I asked them what their main priority was, and they said that they wanted the complaints to stop. So I thought, great, right, we've got somewhere to start now. So I started to analyse the complaints that came through on the viewers' logs. And what I did was I sort of took the Christmas period last year. So for TV, I took a 40-day period because there's a lot more complaints on TV. And over 40 days, I managed to get 100 complaints. Radio, a lot less complaints in radio. So I took an analysis of 120 days from October last year to about January the 31st. And as you can see, the reason why we get a lot more complaints in TV really is because there are spikes in certain programmes. I've listed a few here, and I'll go in the next few slides, I'll actually explain a little bit more about that and why we got those complaints. So, okay, the types of loudness complaints we get. And this is quite interesting because across radio and TV it was exactly the same sort of percentage. The largest percentage is the background music and the effects drowning out the dialogue, 60%. Next one was sound levels jump between content or channel, that was 22%. And the third one was too high a sound range for one programme. Also, interesting enough about this one, when I did go through all the logs, very few films surfaced. It was always home content, our sort of, our homegrown sort of production content that sort of came through. So I'm going to talk a little bit about each one of these problems, and I'll sort of give you a little bit more of analysis about them. So the first one, 60% of the complaints, background music effects drown out the dialogue. Mainly dramas and documentaries. There's nothing the audience can do about this, they switch off. I've got a couple of complaints here that I'd like to maybe read out, just so that you get a flavour of what where the viewer's coming from. So the first one was on the 3rd of January, and it was about Zen. And I'm going to read it out verbatim, so it's going to sound a bit long-winded, but bear with me, please. So the sound quality of this programme was so bad it was impossible to hear. Having read Michael Dibden's books about Zen, I was looking forward to this programme. Sadly, the sound reproduction was so bad that neither my wife or I could hear the script. We have a new TV and the quality of other programmes is excellent, so it's not that. After half an hour, we switched off the programme since we could not hear properly. Another complaint we got, this is quite funny, this one, another one on the 3rd of Jan about Zen. I was looking forward to watching the new series then, and after about halfway through, I'm afraid I switched it off because I was sick to death of the poor sound quality and also the amount of cigarettes that were being lit. Now, we don't really know in that sort of situation whether it was the cigarettes or was it the sound, but obviously it was a compound sort of issue there. Another complaint we got was about upstairs, downstairs. I mentioned on the slides before, we got 30 complaints about upstairs, downstairs. And I'll read one of them out here. It says, having just watched the third part of Upstairs Downstairs and have spent most of the programme turning the sound up and down to deal with the extremely and unnecessarily loud music, it drowned out the characters talking on many occasions. This happens very frequently these days, and there is far too much background noise and loud music. So I went and had a look about it. I thought I'd investigate this programme, Upstairs Downstairs, and what actually happened was that the first two programmes were dubbed in a BBC dubbing suite with a BBC dubbing mixer and a BBC producer, and then the composer of the music was in there as well, and he kept on trying to push the music up, but because it was a BBC producer and a BBC dubbing mixer, they wouldn't allow it. But by the third programme, it was mixed outside of the BBC, and it was done with the freelance dubbing mixer, no producer, and the composer. Now, this freelance dubbing mixer didn't really understand the politics, and he thought that the actual composer was important and, you know, had the power. So he increased the background music, hence we get 30 complaints the next day. So what I'm trying to get here is that the reason this happens is not because of technical reasons. If we left dubbing mixers to actually mix the programme, I could guarantee we'd probably get very few complaints. It's usually artistic reasons that force that background music up. The BBC have got guidelines for this. I don't want to go into that a great deal, but, you know, there's all sorts of issues about regional accents and all sorts of other things that we can sort of like try and work to try and reduce this particular problem. One final complaint we had here on the 10th of January was the gentleman is unhappy at the level of background noise and points of view. Feels the background sound is excessive and distracts from the programme dialogue, which I thought was quite interesting. We got a complaint about the BBC complaints programme. You know, and there was one more I want to read out here. I couldn't find out which programme it was about, but the actual complaint went as thus. I couldn't listen to this programme because of the background sound. When the feature on kelp harvesting came on, I had to switch off as the sound of the waves and the background music meant I could not hear a word that was being said. I don't know what programme it was, but obviously the guy's into kelp harvesting, and we got a bit of a complaint about that. Okay, so the next problem. Sound levels jump between channel or content. Now, going through the logs here, a couple of complaints came up, and I did laugh at first, but then I started to think, no, this is quite a serious issue. I'll read out the first one. We have several complaints. Firstly, the sound of the continuity announcement between programmes is much too high, and we find we have to turn the volume down at the end of one programme and turn it back up at the start of the next. This is causing problems with our neighbours. Now, I did sort of like giggle the first time, then I read another complaint. This came from radio, and it said, the whole programme was too loud, it was atrocious. My neighbour came and knocked on my door to complain about the terrible noise it was causing. I listened to the programme that was on before this programme and never touched the sound dial, so there really is a problem with the volume in which this particular programme was broadcast. I have now fallen out with my neighbour over this, and I am extremely embarrassed. So, it might be funny, but you know, we're causing a social problem here in some areas. I mean, you can imagine people living in London in a small flat, and what people don't realise is they'll be watching a programme and the next piece of content will come along, the volume will be slightly higher, they won't really notice it, but their neighbours will, because they wouldn't have been able to hear the previous one, but they can hear this now. So, you know, we've got to be sort of aware of the sort of impact that we're having on people. So, on to the next slide. The sound reg is too high. This is 18% of complaints. Mainly in drama and music recitals. I'm going to read out two complaints here. The first one said, the sound of this programme is not very good. It is annoying to have to adjust the volume whenever they shift between song and speech. The speech is over loud and distorted at any decent concert volume. This keeps happening on BBC classical coverage. Fair enough, that's a fair enough complaint. And the other one is, the sound is very variable, reducing my enjoyment of the programme. As it is loud then quiet. The sound on both the results programme on the Saturday night showing of the programme, it is loud, quiet, consistently all over the week since the programme started. I couldn't really find out what programme this was about because the complaint doesn't really make a great deal of sense. What we've got to be careful with here at this complaint is that we've got to be aware of what the audience's environment is they're watching in. So if they're in the kitchen, for example, it should be a small dynamic range. If they're in the lounge, it can be larger, and if they're in the home theatre, it can be even wider. But really, the broadcasters need to decide the best fit for the audience. I'll give you an example of what we do on Radio 3. On FM, we slightly process the audio so that we reduce the dynamic range. But on all the digital platforms, we don't have any compression. So we're giving the viewer the choice there. We're making the assumption that if they're listening on FM, they're probably going to be in the kitchen or in the car, so we need to compress the audio. But if they're watching on a digital platform, we're assuming that they're actually in their comfort of their own lounge. So, taking all those sort of complaints, I sort of had a quick look and to see whether or not R128 would solve this. Now, this is a bit sort of like for discussion, I think. The first one, sound levels jumping between content. Yes, we think we can solve this with R128 because we'll have a standard sort of like loudness. Too large a volume range. Maybe we could solve this problem with using R128. We can now measure the actual variation in the volume and decide upon any recourse. And finally, the background noise is too high, 60% of complaints again. Now, possibly we can solve some of this by measuring the background music and then measuring the actual speech and making sure there is a differentiation in dBs between the two of them. We don't really know. So that's really about it, actually. A lot shorter than the previous one. But a bit of food for thought there, don't you think?
Thank you, Phil. Phil, you might be around because we have a few minutes for questions. So if you have any question, then fire off to Phil. Just one brief comment, maybe before you gear up for questions. We had those mixing guidelines, as you might know. Yeah, just a second. Yeah, we had those mixing guidelines in at least Austria and Germany that said your background music should be this level and speech this level. But it all went out of the window once peak normalization, the loudness range went on. But we're now back to that. We could dig those out from 30 years ago and now re-evaluate it based on loudness levels. So what you said as your last point, I think, is very valid, that we can establish new kind of mixing guidelines for broadcasters again based on loudness levels. Absolutely. Please, there was a question here on the side. Yeah. Here on the side is a question. Or you first. Sorry. Yeah, Martin. Yeah.
Martin Spencer, Audescence. Phil, you said you gave us an interesting example, Radio 3, and what's done to the dynamic range on that, where it is lightly compressed on FM, but nothing on the digital platforms. Does that include DAB, digital radio broadcast, being exempt from compression?
Yes, as far as I'm aware. I mean, Simon's in the audience, Simon Tuff's in the audience, who's from Audio Music, and I was discussing it with Rupert yesterday, and he actually mentioned this. Do you agree with that, Simon? Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay.
Another question here in the back?
Yeah, Arshad Russell, S4C. One of the things that interests me is that we've got some very interesting tools in the toolkit here now for perhaps considering the loudness, but just as a listener to the BBC, one thing that I've always been amazed at is why are we persisting in such a big difference between the loudness of something like Radio 4, which is basically a dialogue channel, and perhaps the Radio 2 or something like that. As you switch between those, even within the BBC, there's a massive difference in loudness.
I'm not too sure. Would you agree with that, Simon? That there is a difference in... Yeah? Simon?
Thank you. As Phil said, my name's Simon Tuff. I'm the principal technologist for our radio business. You're absolutely right. We do process the sound differently between the different services, so between Radio 2 and all of the different networks, and there is a big difference in loudness. It's mainly driven for editorial reasons. So it's mainly driven by network controllers choosing a station sound. And to some extent, the research that we have around audience behaviour is that people tend to stick within BBC services to a particular service. They don't hop around too much across the different radio services, and so it doesn't tend to generate a lot of listener resistance or feedback. But we do find that, particularly with the pop music programmes, people gravitate to louder services. So the youth-based services, Radio 1 and 1 Extra, with younger audiences, it does tend to affect listener behaviour if they're slightly more dense. So it's mainly a creative and editorial choice is the reason.
Here's still a gentleman.
It's Kevin Hilton, Television Technology Magazine. This is probably a question for Simon. Just thinking back to the operational techniques used at the BBC. In radio at one time, I think Radio 3 music was peaked at ppm 5 and speech at 6. So is there still that way of working that's perhaps inherently is adding to any potential loudness problems?
Sorry, Phil.
No, you carry on.
So, operational practice within the BBC is an interesting question. Those people, the ppm is still the predominant meter across, I think, all of our services, television and radio. And the operational practices fundamentally amongst the trained craft staff have not changed for 20, 25, 30 years, I would think. The interesting thing is that we have probably fewer highly trained craft staff per hour of content that we broadcast than we used to. And I think there is a potential question around whether quality of audio, the handling of audio quality across the whole of the production work process is as good as it could be. But you have to bear in mind as well that a lot of that now happens outside the corporation. So we are working far more with independent production companies, and they have clear guidelines from us, and we do measure the quality of the stuff that's delivered back to us. Does that kind of help, Kevin? Bit of a
yes. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, okay.
There was a gentleman here in the fifth row. Simon, yeah, maybe you can pass it. Well, thank you.
Hi, it's Morris Snell. I'm interested in your 60% of complaints that can't be solved just with a traditional loudness correction at the transmission point. And I guess you're saying that if in production you can separately loudness control the background to one level and the dialogue to a different level, you could resolve it. And I wondered if either at the BBC or in any of the international standards there are recommended levels to get the right ratio.
Not as yet. I mean, one of the examples that I put up there was Wonders of the Universe. We got 118 complaints last year for one episode, the first episode, and after that, I mean, you can Google it. You'll see the ensuing sort of argument in the Daily Mail between Professor Cox and the production team, and ultimately the BBC decided to err on the side of the viewer. And they did reduce the background, but I don't know the detail of what the actual value. You've got to remember, it's quite a sort of subjective thing, this. It depends on the age of the viewer, you know, how good their hearing is. You know, we do get, I mean, the complaints that I've been reading out here, you read them and you do sort of get the feeling that they're coming from an older generation. We don't really seem to get many complaints from the sort of under 30s. Usually they're sort of, I would say, 40, 50, 60. You can just tell by the way that they presented their complaint. So we don't have any real firm figures yet. I mean, but then again, we don't really measure loudness in the BBC. If you go back to the slides, the actual presentation that I gave to the sort of like the BBC themselves was that we use QPPMs, which don't measure loudness. So really, all the way down the chain, we do have the odd loudness meter in certain dubbing theatres, but generally speaking, for radio and TV, we don't measure loudness all the way through the chain at all. So we don't really know until we adopt R128 and the EBU mode meters. Does that make sense?
Okay. One more? Yeah, yeah. Okay, one more question and then we go on.
This isn't intended to be flippant, but have you noticed any correlation between programs on which you've had a large musical budget, like sort of the really big series like the Brian Cox or David Attenborough series, where you've spent a lot on the music and how loud it is?
No, I wouldn't suggest that. And an example would be the issue with Brian Cox and the Wonders of the Universe. You've got to remember, he had written the script, so he knew what he was saying. He'd practiced it. He was unaware of the effect it would have the first time. The first time a viewer would watch it. So I don't think. I'm just trying to think back. No, we don't seem to get. Because would you agree with that, Simon? That there was any correlation with the big budgets and complaints? I wouldn't really say there was. No. I mean, going back to my analysis, no film came through at all. And there's no real complaint about any films, and they are big budget productions, aren't they?
It's in a way it's a psychological problem too. As a mixer, you have the director be next to you, and the director wants, more power here, more power. But you as a mixer, you're basically the advocate of the listener. You're the one who hears it the first time, maybe, and that's the kind of discussion that goes on. Well, I think that's too much because nobody will understand it. They have only one chance to hear it, and you have read it 10 times, the script or whatever. So this is the kind of, gamble that you do usually as a mixer. I'm a mixer myself, so I have 20 years experience in these kind of psychological issues. But that seems to be one of the crucial things, seems to be speech and intelligibility these days. So once we, I think, have solved the average loudness levels, that we don't have the jumps, and then I think we really should focus on this again. And now that audio, especially in TV, with the loudness issue, is in focus again for a world which is predominant video, as far as TV is concerned, it's now our chance to, on this wave of loudness and of attention, to slot in a couple of the issues that we always wanted to have solved or discuss, like speech intelligibility, like the corporate sound idea. What is my sound as ORF, as BBC or whatever? Is there a sound, or does everybody does it like he wants to? And these kind of things. So general audio quality things can now again be discussed now that audio is really in focus, especially in the TV, dominated world. We have this chance now. And especially intelligibility is a big issue.
Also, going back to that 60% complaint of background noise, I do sort of feel as though, for example, there are certain groups that really do have a finger in the pie here, like the Royal National Institute for the Deaf. They will make a point of trying to make a complaint about these programs because it affects their members and it affects older people far more than it affects younger people. So, I think over the coming years, as we adopt this sort of these recommendations, we will be able to start coming up with values to actually pin to certain programs, to documentaries, and say there should be, I don't know, maybe a 2 dB or a 2 LU. I mean, do you have any idea in your experience about what would be the sort of like the optimum background music with speech above it?
Well, in these days, where music is fully smashed, and energy levels of music are really high, those original ideas that we said music should be 6 dB lower, 10 dB lower, whatever, don't hold anymore because it's the loudness level that we have to look at and not the peak level. And all those were based on peak levels because at those times when those recommendations were written, we didn't have the loudness war and we had people listening to it. And so we could, issue those recommendations also based on the peak level. But it's certainly 6 to 10 dB below speech.
Do you have a gut feeling, though, in using R128 of what this
Absolutely, and I think that's what I said before. We can come back to those recommendations now and base them on average loudness levels. Absolutely. I think we will see them, for sure, yeah. Well, thanks, Phil. I have two things that I take home with me. One is the complaints about the complaint program, which I find fantastic, yeah. So there's a program about audio complaints, and they complain about the mixing quality of the audio complaints program. Great. And then we will add another line in R128, which means smoking is not allowed when normalizing loudness. That's great too, yeah. Final remark to radio also, because there is a recommendation out there that actually limits the multiplex power from EBU. And in Germany and in Austria, and I think also in Switzerland, we stick to that. So that means that the cultural channel is not really lower in level than the pop rock station. So for balancing of radio channels, there is something out there called MPX power, and we have multiplex power limiters. So you can do it, and unfortunately not everybody does it, or not every country does it.